Hi, this is Antoine, writer and creator of The Peril of Haven. If you're just joining us for the first time, welcome. But make sure you do go back and listen to the previous episodes first. If you're rejoining us, welcome back. We definitely appreciate your support. And speaking of support, if you're enjoying the story so far, please make sure to rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps. You can also subscribe to get notified whenever a new episode is released. You could also follow us on social media. The links are in the show notes and on our website. With all that being said, let's get weird. Episode 3: The Joys of Youth.
It's been 3 days. 3 days since the Jameson house, and I've barely left my bed. I want to be more resilient than this. Part of me is disgusted with myself, but I have to be fair. What I experienced in that house was troubling. Look, I've regained my talent for understatement. Clearly that visit wasn't in vain. I'm bitter. It's been 3 days and I'm forcing myself to get up. I'm revisiting the events of that night in as much detail as possible, determined not to shrink from my own mind. If I'm to walk this path that I've been set upon, I have to be able to do this. If I am to embrace my humanity, I have to allow myself the trauma that I experience and find my way through it. I'm angry that I've been put in this position. I'm angry with those kids for insisting that we go to that house at night. I'm furious with that woman for pushing me in this direction without a breath of warning about what I'd be facing. And I'm livid with myself. The version of myself that wrote this journal, then went through who knows what to lose his memory and left a record for a new version of himself to deal with. I'm out of bed. I've showered. I've eaten. I've screamed into my pillow. Now it's time for me to move forward. I recovered my phone from the bedside table. I hadn't touched it since the cafe, and it had died. I plugged it in and powered it on. I had one missed call. The phone number was not the same as the one I had called earlier this week, but to the best of my knowledge, only one person has my phone number. So it was no surprise to hear her voice when I returned the call. She understood that I might need time and had been waiting for me to return her call. She said that she was impressed with how quickly I called back. She was trying to get a rise out of me, but after Mrs. Jameson, it would take more than a snide tone of voice to rattle me. I asked her why she had called. "Well, to check on your progress on the journal, of course," she said teasingly. The familiar tone bothered me more than the snide one had. I asked what she knew about the Jameson house. She said that it was old and abandoned and asked me what I found there. "I suspect you already know," I said as calmly as I could, though I'm certain my voice shook. "If you don't want to talk about it, that's fine," she said. "I am on your side, though." She had a funny way of showing it, and I told her as much. "You haven't given me any answers. You haven't told me so much as your name." She responded with a quick, "Cardia, you'll want to continue with the journal as soon as you're ready. I'll be in touch," and hung up. I considered saving her phone number, but I suspected it would be disconnected by the end of the day. why the mystique? If she were really on my side, wouldn't she give me some answers? Or at least warn me about the strange horrors that I'm likely to come face to face with? After she hung up, a thought occurred to me. I checked the missed call, 12:37 a.m. That would have been around the time I broke that mirror. How could she have known? I suspect there's only one way I'll hear from her again. I'm getting my journal. January 7th, 2020. Dear Journal, I have some sad news. Mrs. Jameson passed away. It must have been right after I left. The newspaper said that she had an accident while checking in on our family home. I knew I should have walked her back to town. I went to the police and told them that I was with her earlier that day. I told them about the visit, and all they had to say was that I shouldn't tell people that. They said that I wasn't a suspect, but that people might act on their own suspicions no matter what the police said. I'll follow their advice. So Mrs. Jameson was alive, and presumably normal when I was there the first time. What I find strange is the fact that the police wouldn't even consider me a person of interest after I confessed to being the last person to see her alive. What kind of overwhelming evidence must they have had that they could so confidently rule out foul play? January 10th, 2020. Dear Journal, I was putting off my next adventure out of respect for Mrs. Jameson. But life is for the living, so I gotta get back to it, right? You won't believe it, but I went into the old St. Barnabas's school for girls just outside of town. I decided that I didn't need an escort for this one. I mean, I'm an experienced explorer now, right? So I waited until dark and drove out to the school. It was pretty easy to get in, but talk about creepy. St. Barnabas's was a boarding school that closed down forever ago. There was so much stuff just there. Like lessons still on chalkboards and books on desks. Up in the rooms there were still clothes and everything just thrown everywhere. It seems like everyone had dolls, but most of the girls didn't bother to bring them with them when they left. Seriously weird stuff. It was definitely a cool time, but next time, I think I want something more. An abandoned Catholic boarding school. What could possibly go wrong there? Getting there might be a problem. There was enough cash left here that I could buy a cheap car, but without a license, that would be a challenge. Not to mention, I don't know how long I'll need that cash to stretch for. I'm content to let this lie for a bit. I'm not feeling particularly keen on reliving another one of those adventures. I guess in the meantime, I'll see what I can find out about the school. I went to the library to see what I could find on St. Barnabas's. Honestly, there wasn't much. The school opened in the 1920s. They accepted non-Catholic students, seeking to follow the lead of St. Barnabas by converting people when possible. And they closed down in 1962. Details on why the school was closed were scarce. It seems that I didn't do my research before heading there the first time, and I'm guessing it didn't occur to me to do it afterward. In the journal, I mentioned that there are some lessons left on the boards and books on desks, dolls and clothes left behind and strewn about. The clothes were probably thrown around by kids trespassing, but everything else implies a very hasty closing. The difficulty in finding any information on it is as bothersome as it is worrying. I was able to find one small blurb in the newspaper that mentions a gas leak at the school right around the time it closed. Words cannot express how eager I am to go on what will undoubtedly be a completely uneventful trip. I can barely wait. But I will. I'm going to bed. Joy of joys. I woke up to find a manila envelope slid under my door. Inside was a car key with a note that read simply, "Don't crash it." I can only assume this is from Cardia. Once again, she seems to know my next move before I do. She obviously knows me from before, but she isn't mentioned in the journal so far. I don't have time to play her games. I have no intention of waiting until nightfall to visit the school. I'm going now. I hope that I'm insane. Before, I couldn't decide which was worse. All of this being in my head, or it being real. I don't want it to be real. I need for it to not be real. How many of these adventures am I supposed to go on? Was I hiding warnings for myself or someone else in those annoyingly cheerful journal entries? Or are my memories trying to return and being twisted into horrifying phantasms by a damaged mind? I can't answer that question. I can only record things as I experience them. Maybe at the end of this I'll lose my memory again. And this can be a more honest account of what I can expect, and the new me can be prepared. I went outside to find a car directly in front of the apartment building, in the no parking zone with its hazard lights on. Cardia predicted my movements again. The car was old and not in particularly good condition, and it was tan. I had a feeling the "don't crash it" note was another attempt at humor. I was tempted to leave the car and let her get a ticket or let the car be towed. Instead, I got in. There was no time to be petulant. I wanted to get there with plenty of sunlight left. The inside of the car smelled like stale French fries, and the ride was bumpy. The first thing I noticed was that most of the windows were boarded up. The irony of rushing to somewhere I did not want to be to take advantage of sunlight that wouldn't benefit me was not lost on me. I decided that it was better to just get it done rather than prolonging my suffering by procrastinating. Fortunately, I came with the same preparations I had at the Jameson house, including the flashlights. The only thing I didn't have was a clear destination. At the Jameson house, I knew that I needed a key from the attic to access the mural in the basement. At St. Barnabas's, I had to guess. The main central structure was 2 floors. On the first floor was a foyer beyond which was the chapel. On the second floor were the dormitories. To either side of the central structure were the classrooms and offices on single-floor wings. The journal didn't mention the chapel, so I decided to exclude the first floor of the central structure and start with the dorms since they covered less ground. Once I was upstairs, I found myself in a long hall. The rooms closest to the stairwell had only 2 beds each, the number of beds increasing as I walked down the hall until the last room, which was crammed with bunk beds and directly across the hall from the bathroom. Presumably, the younger students were packed into the rooms at the end, with the older students getting more privacy and more convenient access to the stairs. After my cursory examination of the layout, I determined that I would have to actually enter the rooms if I had any hope of finding what I might be looking for. I started at the stairwell with the thought that if something important was going to be in a room, it was likely to be with the more privileged students. As I searched the first room, I began to think that it might have been better to wait for nightfall. The odd shaft of sunlight came in through cracks and knotholes in the planks over the windows. but rather than providing any significant illumination, it served only to sharpen the shadows and twist an already eerie setting into something more sinister. The room was as I described in my journal. Clothes were strewn about the floor and beds, and hanging haphazardly out of wardrobes, and there was a doll on each bed. As I searched the wardrobe, I heard one of the dolls hit the floor behind me. I spun around, and a doll was on the ground, tangled in the sweater that had been on the bed. The doll seemed to be looking right at me. It seemed pretty clear that I wouldn't find what I was looking for in that room, and I moved on. The other rooms were similarly disappointing, though I had convinced myself that something was always slightly different in the rooms anytime I turned my back. Sometimes the position of a doll, sometimes the placement of clothing. I told myself that I was letting my anxiety get the best of me, and that I needed to get myself under control. I hesitated to enter the last room. With all of the beds in there would be less space to maneuver should something happen. The number of dolls in the room didn't put me at ease either. There were 16 beds in total, and I could imagine 16 pairs of eyes staring at me. No two dolls were the same. Some had glass eyes, others had their eyes painted on. Some had buttons or embroidery for eyes. One doll in particular nearly kept me from entering the room. It was made of rough-looking burlap, with a face sloppily drawn on, with what looked like charcoal. I searched the room as quickly as I could, and when I found the wardrobe at the far end empty, I turned to leave. That's when I heard a loud impact behind me. I frantically turned to find the wardrobe that I had left open had been slammed shut. I tried to flee, but when I turned toward the exit, the clothes that had been thrown around were standing, as if someone was in them. But the shapes were wrong. There were bumps and sharp angles in places where there shouldn't be. Looking around wildly, I grabbed the burlap doll. Hoping for some kind of pattern, the horrible thing seemed the most likely focus for whatever was happening here. I tore it apart with my hands and my pocket knife. Giggling filled the room as the uniform started to move jerkily toward me. I dove to the side and rolled over the nearest bed, just as a mass of uniforms converged exactly where I had been standing. I dashed into the walkway leading toward the door, and before I could take a step, I felt wool wrap around my neck and tighten. When it touched me, it deflated as if nothing was in the sleeve. I struggled with the sweater, frantically looking around for some advantage. My eyes locked with a pair of glass eyes. The only thought in my mind was, I will not let these dolls watch me die. A strange line to draw, I know, but it gave me the strength to pull myself free. I darted out of the room to find more uniforms in the doorways of the other rooms. I managed to slip past them all and rushed down the steps. In the foyer stood a single uniform holding a doll. I can't be sure, but I think it was the doll from the first room. I didn't go back to check. I ran down the hall and into a random classroom and closed the door. On the chalkboard were illustrations of various stitches and explanations for which stitches were best for which jobs. This may be when the shock was starting to take hold. I found myself transfixed reading the instructions. Suddenly, I heard a dragging sound. There was a dress form in the corner of the room. I hadn't noticed it when I came in. It was sliding toward me, unfinished sleeves flapping in my direction. I ran. The foyer was filled with jerky uniforms. I heard classroom doors slamming down both halls, so I ran into the chapel. I tore a sconce off the wall and forced it through the door handles. In the front of the chapel was a rolling chalkboard with the words, "We proclaim to you good news, that you should turn from these idols to the living God." Acts chapter 14, verse 15. Carved into the board in a way that put my teeth on edge was the letter S after after the word God. The quote ended, "You should turn from these idols to the living gods." The door rattled. I could see a sleeve forcing its way under the door. I heard a heavy dragging sound. In alcoves along the sides of the chapel rested statues of various saints. No, rested isn't the right word. They slowly moved forward out of the alcoves in halting movements. I ran to the front, and on the podium was a huge book. It was stiff and brown. I couldn't read a word of it, but I guessed it was a Bible. That had to be what I was looking for. I rummaged through the chapel until I found matches. The sweater was almost under the door at this point. I broke too many matches, whether out of nerves or because of their age didn't matter. I tried to calm myself as a skirt and socks started forcing their way under the door. Finally, a match caught. Before I could use it to set the book on fire, the sleeves of a priest's vestments wrapped around my arms. A stole wrapped around my throat. The uniform was pulling the sconce out of the door, and the chapel doors crashed open. The edges of my vision grew dark. My shoulders burned from being pulled back by the holy garb. I could see dress forms and the strangely misshapen uniforms coming toward me as I struggled. I could hear the statues of the saints getting closer, then I felt a burning pain on my fingers. The match. I dropped it. I felt something wrap around my legs and pull. My shoulders screamed at the added pressure, and I heard my hip joints pop. My vision sharpened for a moment, then went dark and blurry again. I could feel myself losing consciousness when something flashed in front of me. The pressure on my throat eased for a moment and tightened with renewed vigor. Suddenly, I was dropped on the ground. Apparently, by some miracle, when I dropped the match, it landed on the book. My vision cleared, and I sat up just in time to watch the smoldering remains of the book collapse in on itself. As I left, aching and trembling, I barely registered the pain in my head or the vision of that same field with a circle of stones. It may have been the after-image of the book burning, but I thought I could see firelight in the middle of the circle. As expected, I had a missed call when I got home. I want answers, and I intend to get them, but not today. Today, I'm going to drink. I'm going to huddle in the shower until the water turns cold. Then I'm going to sleep. I won't wait 3 days before I call her. I'll do what I need to do, but today is for me.
That was The Peril of Haven, written and directed by Antoine Martinez-Jones, narrated by Benji Divert. Music is by Conic O'Neill. I was very excited for this episode because you may have noticed some new underscoring that she put together for us. I hope you enjoyed this episode, because next time we see you, life is going to get interesting for Demetrius, and our story is going to start to pick up. We'll be back with you on the first and third Mondays of most months. And don't forget, smile.